The leather-bound law book felt heavy in Louisa Camden's hands as she sat in the shade of the mercantile's awning, her fingers tracing the gold-embossed words on its cover, while the Arizona sun beat down on Apache Junction's dusty Main Street in the summer of 1883. She had borrowed it 3 months ago from the circuit judge who passed through town, promising to return it when he came back through. And in those 3 months, she had read every single page at least twice, memorizing statutes and precedents until the words swam in her dreams. At 22 years old, Louisa had learned the hard way that a woman alone in the Arizona territory needed more than hope to survive. Her father had died 18 months prior, leaving her what he thought was a prosperous cattle ranch, only for her to discover after his death that he had been systematically cheated by a land speculator named Marcus Denton. The contracts her father signed in good faith had been riddled with clauses that stripped away his rights, and by the time Louisa understood what had happened, she had lost half her land and most of her cattle. The shame of it had probably contributed to her father's heart giving out, though the doctor said it was just his time. She had no money for a lawyer, and even if she did, the nearest one was in Phoenix, a 2-day ride away. So Louisa had done the only thing she could think of. She had taught herself the law, studying that borrowed book until her eyes burned and her head ached, determined that no one would ever cheat her again. The sound of hoofbeats made her look up from her reading. 6 riders were coming down the main street, their horses kicking up clouds of red dust that hung in the still air. Louisa recognized the lead rider immediately. Harrison Xavier was hard to miss, even in a territory full of hard men. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a lean, muscular build that spoke of years spent working cattle and breaking horses. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, curling slightly at his collar, and his face had the weathered look of someone who spent most of his life outdoors. But it was his eyes that always caught her attention, a startling shade of blue-gray that seemed to see right through whatever front a person put up. Harrison had arrived in Apache Junction about 6 months ago with his crew, driving a herd of cattle up from Texas to sell to the mines. Instead of moving on like most drovers did, he had stayed, buying a small ranch on the outskirts of town and hiring himself out for various jobs while he built up his own herd. Louisa had spoken to him a handful of times, brief exchanges at the general store or nods of greeting on the street, but she had noticed the way he carried himself with a quiet confidence that did not require him to prove anything to anyone. The riders stopped in front of the saloon, and Harrison dismounted with an easy grace, looping his horse's reins over the hitching post. He said something to his men that made them laugh, then turned and caught sight of Louisa sitting with her book. For a moment their eyes met, and something flickered in his expression, curiosity perhaps, or interest. Then one of his men called out to him, and the moment passed. Harrison tipped his hat to her, a small gesture of acknowledgement, before following his crew into the saloon. Louisa returned her attention to her book, but found herself reading the same paragraph 3 times without absorbing the words. She closed the book with a sigh and stood, brushing dust from her dark blue skirt. The cotton fabric was worn thin in places, and she had mended it more times than she could count, but it was serviceable and modest, which was all that mattered. She had exactly 2 decent dresses to her name, and she wore them in careful rotation, trying to make them last as long as possible. The inside of the mercantile was blessedly cool compared to the street. Martha Henderson, who ran the store with her husband, looked up from the counter where she was sorting through a delivery of canned goods. "Afternoon, Louisa," Martha said with a warm smile. Martha was in her 50s, with kind brown eyes and graying hair pulled back in a sensible bun. She had been a good friend to Louis's mother before consumption took her 10 years ago, and she had continued that friendship with Louisa. "Still studying that law book, I see." "Every chance I get," Louisa replied, setting the book carefully on the counter. "I think I am finally starting to understand property law well enough to find the holes in the contracts Denton used." Martha's expression grew troubled. "Louisa, honey, you know I support what you are trying to do, but Marcus Denton is a powerful man. He has friends, and he does not take kindly to being challenged." "I am aware," Louisa said quietly, "but I cannot just let him steal what my father worked his whole life to build. If I can prove that those contracts were fraudulent, I might be able to get my land back. And if you cannot prove it, or if you do prove it and he decides to make trouble for you—" Martha shook her head. "A woman alone has few enough protections as it is." "That is precisely why I am studying law," Louisa said with more conviction than she felt. "Knowledge is protection, Martha. If I know the law better than Denton does, he cannot cheat me again." Martha studied her for a long moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Your order came in. 2 spools of thread and the fabric you asked about." Louisa's heart sank. "Martha, I told you I could not afford the fabric right now. I only ordered the thread." "I know what you said," Martha replied, her tone brooking no argument. "But I also know that dress you are wearing is about to fall apart, and you need something decent to wear. Consider it an early payment for when you become the territory's first lady lawyer and can afford to pay me back with interest." Tears pricked at Louisa's eyes. "Martha, I cannot accept charity." "It is not charity, it is an investment." Martha pushed the package across the counter. "Besides, Tom and I have done well enough this year. We can spare a few yards of fabric for a friend." Louisa wanted to argue further, but the truth was she desperately needed the fabric. Her dresses were wearing out faster than she could mend them, and she could not afford to look like a pauper if she was going to challenge someone like Marcus Denton. "Thank you," she whispered. "I will pay you back, I promise." "I know you will," Martha said gently. "Now, was there anything else you needed? Actually, I was wondering if you had heard anything about the land office records," Louisa said. "I submitted a request 2 weeks ago to review the original survey maps for my father's property, but I have not heard anything back." Martha's expression turned grim. "I heard Denton's been down at the land office quite a bit lately. Word is he is trying to buy up more property east of town." A chill ran through Louisa despite the heat. "He is consolidating his holdings." "Seems like it. You be careful, Louisa. Men like Denton do not get where they are by playing fair." Louisa nodded and gathered up her package along with the law book. She thanked Martha again and stepped back out into the afternoon heat. The sun was starting its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold. She needed to get back to her ranch before dark. The ride was only about 45 minutes, but she did not like being on the road after sunset. There were too many dangers, from rattlesnakes to the occasional band of outlaws that passed through the territory. She was untying her horse from the hitching post when a voice behind her made her turn. "That is a mighty serious book for light reading." Harrison Xavier stood a few feet away, his thumbs hooked in his belt, his expression curious but not unkind. Up close, Louisa could see the small scar that cut through his left eyebrow and the way the corners of his eyes crinkled when he spoke, as if he was used to smiling even in serious moments. "It is not light reading," Louisa replied, her chin lifting slightly. "It is a law book." "I can see that," Harrison said. "Question is, why is a young woman reading a law book like her life depends on it?" Louisa hesitated. She did not know this man well, and she had learned the hard way that trust was not given lightly in the Arizona territory. But there was something in his eyes, a directness and honesty that made her want to answer truthfully. "Because my life might depend on it," she said finally. "Or at least my livelihood." Harrison's expression grew more serious. "Someone giving you trouble. Someone gave my father trouble, and now I am left to deal with the consequences." Louisa adjusted her grip on the book and her package. "Not that it is any of your concern, Mr. Xavier." "Harrison," he said, "and you are right, it is not my concern. But I have been in this territory long enough to know that a woman alone has a hard time getting justice, especially if she is up against someone with money and influence." "Which is why I am teaching myself the law," Louisa said. "If I know the law better than my adversary, I stand a chance." Harrison studied her for a moment, and Louisa had the uncomfortable feeling that he was seeing more than she wanted to reveal. Finally, he nodded slowly. "That is smart thinking. But knowing the law and getting people to listen to you are two different things." "I am aware of that," Louisa said, unable to keep the frustration out of her voice. "But what choice do I have? I cannot afford a lawyer, and even if I could, most lawyers in this territory are more interested in lining their pockets than seeking justice." "You have got that right," Harrison agreed. He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Who cheated your father?" Louisa debated whether to answer. Part of her wanted to keep her troubles to herself, to maintain the fiction that she was managing fine on her own. But another part of her, the part that was tired and scared and desperately lonely, wanted to share the burden with someone who might understand. "Marcus Denton," she said finally. "The land speculator. He sold my father a series of contracts that looked legitimate on the surface, but were designed to transfer ownership gradually. By the time my father realized what was happening, it was too late. He died thinking he had failed, leaving me a mess to clean up." Harrison's jaw tightened. "I have heard of Denton. He has a reputation for sharp dealing." "That is a polite way of saying he is a crook," Louisa said bitterly. "But he operates just inside the boundaries of the law, or at least he knows how to make it look that way. That is why I need to understand the law better than he does. If I can find the flaws in those contracts, I might be able to prove fraud and get my land back." "That is a tall order," Harrison said. "Even if you find proof, you would need someone to present your case. A judge is not likely to take a woman's word over a man like Denton's." The truth of his words hit Louisa like a physical blow, even though she had known it all along. "Then I will find a way to make him listen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have to." Harrison looked at her for a long moment, and something shifted in his expression. "What is your name?" he asked. "Louisa Camden." "Louisa," he repeated, as if testing how it sounded. "I heard about your father. He was a good man by all accounts. I am sorry for your loss." "Thank you," Louisa said, surprised by the genuine sympathy in his voice. "I should get home before dark. Where is your ranch?" "About 8 miles northeast of here, near the base of the Superstition Mountains." Harrison's eyebrows rose. "That is a long ride for a woman alone, especially this late in the day." "I make it every time I come to town," Louisa said, a touch of defensiveness creeping into her voice. "I know how to handle myself." "I do not doubt that," Harrison said. "But knowing how to handle yourself and being safe are not always the same thing. Mind if I ride with you? My ranch is in the same direction." Louisa opened her mouth to refuse, to insist that she did not need an escort, but the words died on her lips. The truth was, she would feel safer with someone riding alongside her, even if her pride balked at admitting it. "I suppose that would be all right," she said finally. Harrison's face relaxed into a smile, and Louisa felt something flutter in her chest. It was the first genuine smile anyone had directed at her in months, and it transformed his already handsome face into something even more appealing. "I will just settle up inside and get my horse," he said. "Give me 2 minutes." True to his word, Harrison emerged from the saloon less than 2 minutes later. He swung up into his saddle with practiced ease, and they set off down the main street at a comfortable walk. For the first mile or so, they rode in silence, the only sounds the steady clip-clop of their horses' hooves and the occasional call of a desert bird. It was Harrison who finally broke the silence. "How long have you been studying that law book?" "About 3 months," Louisa replied. "The circuit judge loaned it to me when he passed through in March. He will be back in September, and I need to return it then." 3 months, Harrison said thoughtfully. "That is not much time to learn a profession that takes most men years to master." "I am not trying to become a professional lawyer," Louisa said. "I just need to know enough to protect myself and maybe get back what was stolen from me. Still, it must be difficult trying to learn all that on your own." "It is," Louisa admitted. "Some of the language is archaic and there are references to cases I have never heard of, but I have always been good at figuring things out. My father used to say I had a mind like a steel trap." "He sounds like he was proud of you." "He was," Louisa said softly, "which makes it worse somehow. He died thinking he had failed me, left me with nothing. If only I had known what Denton was doing sooner, maybe I could have stopped it. Maybe my father would still be alive." "You cannot think like that," Harrison said, his voice gentle but firm. "You cannot carry the weight of what-ifs. Your father made decisions based on what he knew at the time, and Denton took advantage of that. The fault lies with Denton, not with you or your father." Louisa blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. "Maybe, but that does not change the fact that I am the one left dealing with the consequences." They rode in silence for a while longer, the landscape around them gradually shifting from the flat desert plains to the more rugged terrain near the mountains. The Superstition Mountains loomed ahead, their distinctive peaks turning purple in the fading light. "Can I ask you something?" Harrison said eventually, "I suppose. Why did you not just sell what was left and move somewhere else? Start fresh?" It was a question Louisa had asked herself 100 times. "Because this is my home," she said simply. "My parents built that ranch with their own hands. My mother is buried there. Every fence post, every water trough, every building represents years of their hard work and sacrifice. I cannot just walk away from that. I will not." Harrison nodded as if he understood. "I respect that. A lot of people would have given up by now." "Giving up is not in my nature," Louisa said. "My mother used to say I was too stubborn for my own good." "Stubborn can be a virtue in the right circumstances, or a curse," Louisa said with a slight smile, "depending on who you ask." They had reached a fork in the road. To the left was the path to Louisa's ranch, while the right branch led to the newer homesteads on the western side of the mountains. "This is where I turn off," Louisa said, pulling her horse to a stop. "Thank you for riding with me, Harrison. It was kind of you." "It was my pleasure," Harrison said. He hesitated, as if weighing whether to say something more, then continued. "Louisa, if you need help with Denton or anything else, I hope you will let me know. I may not be a lawyer, but I know a thing or two about dealing with men who think they can push people around." Louisa felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. It had been so long since anyone had offered to help her, and the gesture touched her more than she wanted to admit. "Why would you do that?" she asked. "You barely know me." Harrison's blue-gray eyes met hers, and there was an intensity in his gaze that made her breath catch. "Maybe I would like to know you better," he said simply. "And maybe I do not like seeing good people get cheated by men like Denton. I have seen too much of that in my life." "Where are you from originally?" Louisa asked, suddenly curious about this man who had appeared in her life at such an opportune moment. Texas, Harrison said. Born and raised on a ranch near San Antonio. Worked cattle drives for years before deciding to start my own spread. Figured the Arizona territory offered better opportunities than staying in Texas. What made you choose Apache Junction? Harrison was quiet for a moment, and Louisa sensed she had touched on something personal. I was looking for a fresh start, he said finally. Sometimes a man needs to put some distance between himself and his past. Louisa wanted to ask more, to understand what had driven him to leave his home state, but she recognized the boundary in his voice. Everyone had secrets, and she was hardly in a position to judge. Well, I am glad you chose Apache Junction, she said. The town can use more good people. Does that mean you think I am a good person? Harrison asked, and there was a teasing note in his voice that made Louisa smile. I reserve judgment, she said, but her tone was light. Though the fact that you offered to help a woman you barely know speaks in your favor. I will take that as a provisional endorsement, Harrison said with a grin. Can I ask one more thing before you go? All right. Would it be acceptable if I stopped by your ranch sometime? I could take a look at those contracts you mentioned. I am no lawyer, but I have read my share of cattle sale agreements and land deeds. Might be I could offer a different perspective. Louisa's first instinct was to refuse. She had been managing on her own for so long that the thought of accepting help felt like admitting weakness. But as she looked at Harrison's earnest expression, she realized that refusing help out of pride was foolish. If he could see something in those contracts that she had missed, it would be worth swallowing her pride. That would be acceptable, she said. Perhaps Sunday afternoon, if you are free, I could make coffee. Sunday afternoon sounds perfect, Harrison said. I will see you then. They parted ways, and Louisa guided her horse down the narrow path toward her ranch. As she rode, she found herself thinking about Harrison Xavier and the unexpected kindness he had shown her. She did not know what to make of him yet. Men in the Arizona territory rarely did something for nothing, and she had learned to be cautious about trusting strangers. But there had been something genuine in Harrison's offer, a sincerity that was hard to fake. By the time she reached her ranch, full darkness had fallen. The small house her parents had built stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its wooden walls weathered but sturdy. The barn and corral were off to the left, and she could see her remaining cattle, maybe 30 head at most, clustered near the water trough. It was a far cry from the 150 head her father had once owned. Louisa unsaddled her horse and rubbed him down, making sure he had fresh water and hay before heading into the house. The interior was dark and empty, and the loneliness hit her like it always did when she came home to the silent rooms. She lit a lamp and set about making herself a simple dinner of beans and cornbread, the same meal she ate most nights because it was cheap and filling. As she ate, she opened the law book again and continued her reading, taking notes on a precious piece of paper she would later transcribe into the journal where she kept all her legal research. The language was dense and often confusing, but she forced herself to work through it, paragraph by paragraph, until her eyes burned with fatigue. It was nearly midnight when she finally closed the book and prepared for bed. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the night sounds of the desert, she found her thoughts drifting back to Harrison. There was something about him that made her feel safer, more hopeful. It was a dangerous feeling. Hope could be a curse when it led you to trust the wrong person. But as sleep finally claimed her, Louisa allowed herself to indulge in the small fantasy that maybe, just maybe, she had found an ally in her fight against Marcus Denton. Sunday arrived with the promise of another scorching day. Louisa woke early, as she always did, and spent the morning doing chores around the ranch. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, tended to her small vegetable garden, and checked on the cattle. By noon, she had worked up a considerable sweat, and she allowed herself the luxury of heating water for a proper bath. She washed her hair with the precious bar of lavender soap she had been saving, then dressed in her other good dress, a light gray cotton with small buttons down the front. It was nearly as worn as her blue dress, but she had mended it carefully, and it was still presentable. She brushed out her dark brown hair and pinned it up in a simple style, leaving a few soft tendrils framing her face. It was foolish to go to such trouble for a man who was simply coming to look at contracts, Louisa told herself. But as she caught sight of her reflection in the small mirror above her washstand, she could not help feeling a small thrill of anticipation. It had been a long time since she had cared about her appearance, and even longer since she had looked forward to someone's company. Harrison arrived promptly at 2 o'clock, riding a beautiful sorrel gelding that looked like it had some thoroughbred blood. He was dressed in clean denim pants and a white shirt that emphasized his tanned skin and dark hair. He had shaved recently, and Louisa caught the faint scent of bay rum as he removed his hat and greeted her. "Afternoon, Louisa," he said with that easy smile that made something flutter in her chest. "I hope I am not too early." "Your timing is perfect," Louisa said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Please come in. I have coffee ready." The interior of the house was modest but clean. The main room served as both parlor and kitchen, with a simple wooden table and chairs, a cast iron stove, and a few pieces of furniture that had seen better days. A doorway led to the single bedroom, and there was a small loft above where Louisa stored supplies. Harrison looked around with interest, but made no comment on the obvious poverty of her circumstances. Instead, he said, "You have a nice view of the mountains from here." "My mother chose this spot specifically for that reason," Louisa said, pouring coffee into 2 chipped mugs. She said that no matter how hard life got, looking at those mountains reminded her that there was always something bigger and more permanent than our troubles. "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Louisa said softly. "I wish she had lived to see me grown. I think she would have approved of me fighting back against Denton." They sat at the table, and Louisa pulled out a worn leather folder containing the contracts her father had signed. There were 5 separate documents, each one dense with legal language and provisions. "These are what Denton used," she said, spreading them out on the table. On the surface, they look like standard land lease agreements and cattle sale contracts. But when you read them carefully, there are clauses buried in the fine print that basically give Denton the right to claim ownership if certain conditions are not met. Harrison pulled the first document toward him and began reading, his brow furrowed in concentration. Louisa watched him as he read, noting the way his eyes moved quickly across the page, pausing occasionally to reread a particularly complex section. His hands were large and work-roughened, but he handled the delicate paper with surprising care. After several minutes he looked up, his expression grim. "This is worse than you described. These clauses are deliberately obscure. It would take a lawyer to understand what they really mean." "That is exactly the problem," Louisa said. "My father was a rancher, not a lawyer. He trusted Denton because Denton presented himself as a legitimate businessman trying to help struggling ranchers. By the time my father realized what the contracts actually said, he was already in violation of multiple provisions." Harrison picked up the second contract and read through it, then the third. With each document, his expression grew darker. Finally, he set down the last contract and looked at Louisa with a mixture of anger and admiration. "How much of your father's property did Denton end up taking?" "Half the land, about 600 acres, most of the cattle, All the water rights to the main creek that runs through the property. Louisa's voice was steady, but Harrison could hear the pain underneath. We went from being a prosperous ranch to barely scraping by in the space of 18 months. And you have been studying law to find a way to challenge these contracts. Yes, I have been looking for precedents, cases where contracts were invalidated due to fraud or misrepresentation. I think I have found a few that might apply, but I need to understand the nuances better. Harrison sat back in his chair, his coffee forgotten. Louisa, even if you find the legal basis to challenge these contracts, you are going to face an uphill battle. Denton has money, influence, and probably knows every judge in the territory. What you need is someone who can present your case in a way that cannot be dismissed. I know, Louisa said, frustration creeping into her voice. But I do not have the money to hire a lawyer, and even if I did, I am not sure any of them would take a case against Denton. He is too powerful. Then we need to find another way, Harrison said firmly. No one will cheat you again, Louisa. I give you my word on that. The intensity in his voice startled her. Why? She asked softly. Why do you care so much about what happens to me? Harrison was quiet for a long moment, his blue-gray eyes searching her face as if trying to decide how much to reveal. Finally, he said, because I know what it is like to be cheated, to watch someone you love lose everything because of another man's greed. I could not stop it then, but maybe I can help you stop it now. What happened? Louisa asked gently. Harrison's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he would not answer. Then he said, my father had a ranch in Texas, a good-sized spread that had been in our family for 2 generations. When I was 19, a cattle baron named William Garrett decided he wanted our land. He used every dirty trick in the book to try to force my father to sell. When my father refused, Garrett found a way to claim that my father's deed was fraudulent, that the land had never legally belonged to our family. Was it true? No, Harrison said flatly, but Garrett had enough money and influence to make it stick in court. We lost everything. My father was so broken by it that he died less than a year later. My mother followed him 6 months after that. I have been on my own ever since, trying to build something of my own. Louisa reached across the table and placed her hand over his. I am so sorry, Harrison. That must have been devastating. His hand turned under hers, his fingers curling around hers in a gentle grip. It was, but it taught me something important. It taught me that the law can be a weapon in the hands of powerful men, but it can also be a shield if you know how to use it properly. That is what you are trying to do, Louisa. You are teaching yourself to use the law as a shield, and I respect the hell out of that. They sat like that for several moments, hands linked across the table, a silent understanding passing between them. Louisa felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness but from the overwhelming relief of finally having someone who understood, who had walked a similar path and knew exactly how she felt. So what do we do? She asked finally. How do we fight someone like Denton? Harrison released her hand and picked up the contracts again, studying them with renewed focus. First, we document everything. Every clause, every provision, every piece of evidence that these contracts were designed to defraud your father. Then we look for witnesses. Were there other ranchers who dealt with Denton? Anyone else who might have been cheated? Louisa nodded slowly. There were a few others. The Thompson family lost their ranch about 2 years ago. They moved to California afterward. And old Henry Walsh, he had some dealings with Denton but managed to back out before things got too bad. He might be willing to talk. Good. We need to build a case that shows a pattern of behavior. If we can prove that Denton has been systematically defrauding ranchers, it strengthens your position. Harrison stood and began pacing, his mind clearly working through the problem. We also need to get copies of the original land surveys and deeds from the Territorial Land Office. If there are any discrepancies between what Denton claims and what the official records show, that could be crucial. I requested those records 2 weeks ago, Louisa said, but the land office has been slow to respond. Probably because Denton has someone there in his pocket, Harrison said grimly. We may need to go to Phoenix and access the records directly. It is harder for them to refuse if you show up in person. That is a 2-day ride each way, Louisa said. I cannot be away from the ranch that long. The cattle need tending, and I have no one to leave them with. I could tend your cattle, Harrison offered. Or better yet, I could hire one of my men to stay here while we go to Phoenix together. It would be safer for you to have someone along anyway. Louisa wanted to argue, to insist that she could manage on her own, but the practical part of her brain recognized the wisdom of his suggestion. You have done so much already, she said. I cannot ask you to do more. You are not asking. I am offering. Harrison sat back down at the table, his expression serious. Louisa, I meant what I said. No one is going to cheat you again, not while I have any say in the matter. Let me help you. There was something in his voice, a determination mixed with a tenderness that made Louisa's heart race. She looked into his eyes and saw not pity but respect and something else, something warmer and more personal that she was afraid to name. All right, she said softly. We will go to Phoenix together, but I insist on paying for my own supplies and expenses. I may be poor, but I still have my pride. Harrison's lips curved into a small smile. I would not expect anything less. How about we plan to leave this Thursday? That gives us a few days to make arrangements. They spent the next hour going through the contracts in detail, with Harrison asking questions and Louisa explaining what she had learned from the law book. Despite the serious nature of their discussion, Louisa found herself enjoying Harrison's company. He listened when she spoke, really listened, and he did not talk down to her or dismiss her observations. When she pointed out a particularly clever piece of legal reasoning she had discovered, he looked genuinely impressed. You have a gift for this, he said at one point. Have you ever thought about actually becoming a lawyer? Louisa laughed, a slightly bitter sound. Women cannot be lawyers, Harrison, at least not in the Arizona Territory. I am barely allowed to own property in my own name. Maybe not yet, Harrison said, but things are changing. Women got the vote in Wyoming Territory a few years back. Who knows what might happen in the future? I will be content if I can just get my father's land back, Louisa said. That is ambitious enough for now. As the afternoon wore on, they moved on to other topics. Harrison told her about his ranch, which he had named the Double X after his surname, and his plans to build it into a successful cattle operation. Louisa shared stories about growing up in the Arizona Territory, the challenges of living in such an unforgiving landscape, and the small joys that made it worthwhile. You ever think about leaving? Harrison asked at one point. Going somewhere easier, maybe back east where there are more opportunities for women. Never, Louisa said firmly. This is my home. The desert may be harsh, but it is honest. It does not pretend to be something it is not, and I appreciate that. Besides, I have seen too many sunsets over the Superstition Mountains to ever want to trade them for city streets and crowded buildings. I feel the same way, Harrison said. There is something about this land that gets into your blood. It is not for everyone, but for those of us who belong here, there is nowhere else we would rather be. The sun was beginning to set when Harrison finally stood to leave. Louisa walked him outside, and they stood for a moment looking at the orange and pink sky stretching above the mountains. Thank you for today, Louisa said. It means more than I can say to have someone on my side. You do not need to thank me, Harrison said. He turned to face her, and in the golden light of the setting sun, his eyes seemed to glow. "Louisa, I want you to know that this is not just about fighting Denton. I enjoy your company. You are smart and brave and more capable than most men I have known. I would like to spend more time with you if you are amenable to that." Louisa's breath caught in her throat. It had been so long since anyone had expressed interest in her as anything other than a business transaction or an obligation to be fulfilled. "I would like that too," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Harrison reached out and gently tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering for just a moment against her cheek. The touch was light, respectful, but it sent a shiver through Louisa's entire body. "I will see you Thursday morning then," he said. "Be ready to leave at first light. It is a long ride to Phoenix." "I will be ready," Louisa promised. She watched him ride away, his figure growing smaller as he followed the path back toward his own ranch. When he finally disappeared from view, Louisa went back inside and sat at the table, her mind spinning with everything that had happened. In the space of one afternoon, her entire world had shifted. She was no longer alone in her fight against Marcus Denton. More than that, she had found something she had not been looking for, something that both excited and terrified her. She was beginning to care for Harrison Xavier, and from the way he had looked at her, the gentle way he had touched her face, she thought he might be beginning to care for her too. It was dangerous to let herself feel this way. She had more important things to focus on, like saving her ranch and exposing Denton's fraud. But as she prepared for bed that night, Louisa could not stop thinking about the warmth in Harrison's eyes or the way her heart had raced at his touch. The next few days passed in a flurry of preparation. Louisa spent Monday and Tuesday organizing everything at the ranch so it could run with minimal supervision for a few days. She also went through the law book again, making detailed notes about the specific statutes and precedents she thought might apply to her case. On Wednesday, Harrison arrived with one of his ranch hands, a quiet man named Robert who agreed to stay at Louisa's ranch and tend to the cattle while they were gone. "Robert is trustworthy," Harrison assured her. "He has worked for me since I arrived in Apache Junction, and I would trust him with my life." Robert tipped his hat to Louisa. "Miss Camden, I will take good care of your place. You have my word." "Thank you, Robert," Louisa said. "The cattle are pretty self-sufficient, but they will need to be checked once a day to make sure none have wandered off or gotten into trouble. The chickens need to be fed morning and evening, and please collect the eggs. You are welcome to use them while we are gone." "Yes, madam," Robert said. "Do not worry about a thing. Mr. Xavier and I will make sure everything is in order when you return." That night, Louisa packed a small bag with extra clothes and the precious contracts and documents she would need in Phoenix. She also carefully wrapped the law book in oilcloth to protect it from dust and potential rain. She knew she was taking a risk bringing it on the journey, but she might need to reference specific passages, and she could not afford to be without it. Harrison arrived just as the first light of dawn was breaking over the eastern horizon. He had 2 horses with him, his own sorrel gelding and a sturdy bay mare that he had brought for Louisa. "I figured your horse could use a rest," he explained. "Rosie here is gentle, but she has good stamina. She will get you to Phoenix and back without any trouble." Louisa transferred her belongings to the bay mare and said goodbye to Robert, giving him a few last-minute instructions. Then she and Harrison set off, heading southwest toward Phoenix. The air was still cool from the night, but Louisa knew it would heat up quickly once the sun climbed higher in the sky. They rode at a steady pace, covering ground efficiently but not pushing the horses too hard. Harrison had packed supplies for the journey, including food, water, and bedrolls. He had clearly done this kind of trip before and knew exactly what was needed. As they rode, they talked about everything and nothing. Harrison shared more stories about his life in Texas, his years working cattle drives, and the various adventures he had experienced. Louisa found herself laughing at some of his tales, particularly one involving a stubborn bull and a very unfortunate cowboy who ended up in a water trough. "You should have seen his face," Harrison said, grinning at the memory. He was so mad he could not even speak, just sputtered and stomped around dripping wet while the rest of us tried not to laugh. "It sounds like you have had quite an interesting life," Louisa said. "It has had its moments," Harrison agreed, "though I am ready for a different kind of life now. One with more stability and less wandering." "Is that why you bought your ranch?" "Partly. I wanted a place to call my own, something no one could take away from me." He paused, then added, "I also wanted roots. I have been drifting for so long I forgot what it felt like to belong somewhere." "And do you feel like you belong in Apache Junction?" Harrison glanced at her, and there was something warm and meaningful in his expression. "I am starting to," he said softly. They stopped around midday to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of jerky and hardtack. The landscape around them was classic Arizona desert, all red rock formations, scraggly mesquite trees, and endless stretches of sand and stone. The heat was intense, and Louisa was grateful for the wide-brimmed hat she wore to protect her face from the sun. "How much farther to Phoenix?" she asked as they prepared to mount up again. "We should reach it by late afternoon tomorrow," Harrison said. "We will camp tonight and get an early start in the morning. There is a good spot I know about 10 miles ahead, near a small creek with some shade trees." The campsite Harrison had mentioned turned out to be exactly as he described. A small oasis in the desert with a trickle of water running through a rocky channel, and a few cottonwood trees providing blessed shade. They made camp as the sun began to set, and Harrison built a small fire while Louisa unpacked their food supplies. As darkness fell, they sat by the fire eating beans and bacon that Harrison cooked in a small iron skillet. The temperature dropped quickly once the sun went down, and Louisa found herself grateful for the fire's warmth. "Tell me more about your mother," Harrison said as they ate. "You mentioned she chose the location for your ranch because of the view, but I do not know much else about her." Louisa smiled at the memory of her mother. She was strong and practical, but she also had a romantic side. She loved poetry and would recite verses while she worked. Her favorite was Walt Whitman. She said his poems captured the wildness and freedom of the American spirit. "What did she die from?" "Consumption," Louisa said quietly. "It took her slowly over the course of 2 years. By the end, she could barely breathe, but she never complained. She just kept reciting her poetry and telling my father and me how much she loved us." "How old were you when she passed?" 12. "Old enough to understand I was losing her, but too young to really know how to cope with it." Louisa stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. "My father never really recovered. Oh, he kept going, kept working the ranch, but part of him died with her. I think that is why he was so easy for Denton to manipulate. He just did not have the energy to fight anymore." Harrison moved closer to her, closing the distance between them until their shoulders were almost touching. "You have had to be strong for a very long time," he said gently. "It is all right to admit that it has been hard." Tears stung Louisa's eyes. "I do not usually talk about this," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I learned early on that crying and complaining do not change anything. You just have to keep moving forward." "That is true," Harrison said. "But you do not always have to move forward alone. Sometimes sharing the burden makes it easier to carry." Louisa turned to look at him, and in the firelight his face was all plains and shadows, handsome and kind and utterly sincere. Without thinking, She leaned her head against his shoulder, and after a moment's hesitation, Harrison wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. They sat like that for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers while the desert night came alive with sounds around them. It was the most intimate moment Louisa had experienced in years, and it felt both terrifying and absolutely right. Eventually, Harrison stirred. "We should get some sleep. Tomorrow is going to be a long day." Reluctantly, Louisa pulled away and moved to her bedroll, which Harrison had laid out on the opposite side of the fire from his own, a respectful distance away. As she lay down and pulled the blanket over herself, she heard Harrison settling into his own bedroll. "Good night, Louisa," he said softly. "Good night, Harrison." Sleep came slowly, and when it finally did, Louisa's dreams were filled with images of blue-gray eyes and gentle touches, of a future that seemed both impossible and tantalizingly within reach. They reached Phoenix in the late afternoon of the following day, dusty and tired but determined. Phoenix was larger than Apache Junction, with more substantial buildings and a busier main street. Harrison led them directly to a modest hotel where they could clean up and rest. "I will get you a room," he said as they dismounted in front of the hotel. "We can visit the land office first thing tomorrow morning." The hotel clerk, a thin man with spectacles and a suspicious expression, looked them up and down before speaking. "You want one room or two?" "Two," Harrison said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. "The lady is a business associate." The clerk's expression made it clear he did not believe that for a moment, but he handed over 2 keys without further comment. Louisa felt her face flush with embarrassment and anger. She hated the assumptions people made about women traveling with men who were not their husbands. Harrison must have noticed her discomfort because once they were upstairs, he said, "Ignore him. His opinion does not matter." "It matters when it affects my reputation," Louisa said quietly. "I am already fighting an uphill battle as a woman trying to challenge a powerful man. I cannot afford to have people questioning my character." "Anyone who questions your character is a fool," Harrison said with conviction. "You are one of the most honorable people I have ever met, Louisa. Do not let small-minded people make you doubt that." His words soothed her wounded pride, and she managed a small smile. "Thank you, Harrison, for everything. Get some rest," he said. "I will meet you downstairs for dinner in an hour." Louisa used the time to wash the trail dust from her face and hands, change into her other dress, and brush out her hair. She felt almost human again by the time she went downstairs to the hotel's small dining room where Harrison was waiting. They ate a simple but filling meal of beef stew and fresh bread, and Louisa savored every bite. It had been a long time since she had eaten food she had not cooked herself, and the change was welcome. "Tomorrow we need to be strategic," Harrison said as they ate. "The land office opens at 8. We should be there when the doors open, before anyone has a chance to warn them we are coming." "You think Denton has people watching the land office?" "I think Denton has people everywhere," Harrison said grimly. "A man does not build the kind of empire he has without having eyes and ears in important places. Then we need to be careful about what we say and who we trust." "Exactly." Harrison leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "Once we get the records, we need to review them carefully and make copies of anything relevant. Do you know shorthand?" "A little. My mother taught me some basic shorthand when I was young. She thought it might be useful someday. It will be useful tomorrow. We may not have much time to go through the records, so we will need to work quickly and efficiently." That night, Louisa lay in her narrow hotel bed, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the city. Horses and wagons passed on the street below, and she could hear the faint sounds of a piano from the saloon down the block. It was so different from the quiet isolation of her ranch, and she found herself feeling homesick for the familiar silence of the desert. But she was also excited. Tomorrow they would finally get the evidence she needed to build a case against Marcus Denton. After months of studying and planning, she was finally taking real action, and it felt both exhilarating and terrifying. The Territorial Land Office was an unassuming building on a side street, distinguished only by the official seal painted on its door. Louisa and Harrison arrived just as the clerk was unlocking the door for the day's business. The clerk, a young man who could not have been more than 25, looked surprised to see them. "Help you folks with something. I am Louisa Camden from Apache Junction," Louisa said, stepping forward with more confidence than she felt. "I submitted a request several weeks ago to review the original land survey records for my property. I am here to follow up on that request." The clerk's expression grew cautious. "Camden," you said, "let me check our records." He disappeared into a back room, leaving Louisa and Harrison waiting in the small front office. Minutes ticked by, and Louisa felt her anxiety growing. What if the records had been destroyed? What if Denton had already gotten to them? Finally, the clerk returned, carrying a large ledger book and several rolled documents. "I found your request," he said, "but I am afraid I cannot release these records without authorization from the territorial surveyor." "The records are public documents," Louisa said, fighting to keep her voice level. "I have a legal right to review them." "That may be, miss, but my instructions are clear. No records leave this office without proper authorization." Harrison stepped forward, his tall frame and stern expression clearly making the clerk nervous. "She is not asking to remove the records. She is asking to review them here in your office. That is well within her rights as a property owner." The clerk shifted uncomfortably. "I suppose that would be acceptable, but I will need to stay in the room while you review them." "That is fine," Louisa said quickly, before the clerk could change his mind. They were led to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. The clerk spread out the documents and opened the ledger book to the relevant pages. "You have 1 hour," he said. "After that, I will need this room for other business." As soon as he left, Louisa and Harrison got to work. The documents were old, and the handwriting was difficult to decipher in places, but they methodically went through each one, comparing the original survey maps to the property descriptions in Denton's contracts. "Look at this," Harrison said after about 20 minutes, pointing to a section of the survey map. "The original survey clearly shows that the creek runs through your father's property for its entire length. But according to this contract, Denton claimed the water rights extended to his adjacent property." Louisa leaned over to look, her heart racing. "That is fraud. The water rights should have stayed with my father's land." They continued searching and found several more discrepancies. The boundary lines on Denton's contracts did not match the official survey maps. Acreage figures were different. Most damning of all, they found a notation in the ledger indicating that someone had requested an amendment to the original survey 2 years ago, coincidentally right around the time her father had signed his first contract with Denton. Who requested the amendment? Harrison asked, running his finger down the page. Louisa found the entry and felt her blood run cold. Marcus Denton. But the amendment was never officially approved. It looks like the request was denied by the territorial surveyor. But Denton acted as if it had been approved, Harrison said, understanding dawning in his eyes. He created contracts based on survey information that was never legally valid. Which means the contracts themselves are fraudulent, Louisa said, her voice shaking with excitement and anger. "We have him, Harrison. This proves he knowingly used false information." They spent the rest of their allotted hour carefully copying the relevant information, with Louisa using her shorthand to record the details as quickly as possible. When the clerk returned, they thanked him politely and left the land office, trying to appear casual even though Louisa wanted to run down the street shouting her discovery. Once they were safely back at the hotel, Louisa pulled out her notes and began transcribing them into more legible form. Harrison watched her work, admiration clear on his face. "You did it," he said softly. "You found the proof you needed." "We did it," Louisa corrected. "I could not have done this without you, Harrison. You gave me the courage to keep fighting when I was ready to give up." Harrison reached across the table and took her hand. "You were never going to give up, Louisa. That is not who you are. I just helped you see what you already had inside you." They stayed in Phoenix one more night, and the next morning began the journey back to Apache Junction. The ride back felt different somehow, lighter despite the same harsh sun and dusty trail. Louisa felt like a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. She finally had concrete evidence of Denton's fraud, and with it, a real chance of getting justice. As they rode, Harrison told her about his plans for the Double X Ranch. He wanted to expand his herd, build a bigger house, maybe even start breeding horses. His enthusiasm was infectious, and Louisa found herself imagining what it would be like to be part of those plans, to build something lasting alongside him. They camped again that night at the same spot near the creek. This time, when they sat by the fire after dinner, Harrison did not hesitate before putting his arm around Louisa's shoulders, and she leaned into him naturally, as if they had been doing this for years instead of days. "Can I ask you something?" Harrison said after a while. "Of course." "What will you do if you win? If you get your land back and Denton is exposed?" Louisa thought about it for a moment. "I will rebuild. Get more cattle, repair the buildings, make the ranch profitable again. That is what my father would have wanted. And after that, once the ranch is stable—" "I do not know," Louisa admitted. "I have been so focused on fighting Denton that I have not thought much about the future beyond that." Harrison was quiet for a moment, then said, "I have been thinking about the future a lot lately. Specifically, about what I want my life to look like a year from now, 5 years from now." "And what do you see?" Louisa asked softly. "I see a successful ranch. I see a home filled with warmth and laughter. I see children learning to ride horses and tend cattle." He paused, then added, "And I see a woman who is my equal partner in all of it, someone strong and smart who challenges me to be better." Louisa's heart was pounding so hard she was sure Harrison could hear it. "That sounds like a beautiful future." "I think so too." Harrison shifted so he could look at her directly, his blue-gray eyes intense in the firelight. "Louisa, I know this might seem sudden. We have only known each other a short time, but I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. You are brave and brilliant, and you do not back down from a fight. You are exactly the kind of woman I want by my side." "Harrison," Louisa whispered, afraid to believe what she was hearing. "I am not asking you to marry me tomorrow," he continued. "I know you need to focus on getting your land back and building your life back up, but I want you to know that I am serious about you, about us. I want to court you properly, Louisa. I want to see where this goes." Tears filled Louisa's eyes, but they were happy tears this time. "I want that too," she said. "I have been alone for so long, I forgot what it was like to have someone care about me. You make me feel like I am not fighting this battle by myself anymore." "You are not," Harrison said firmly. "Whatever happens with Denton, whatever challenges come our way, we will face them together. I promise you that." He leaned in slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wanted to, but Louisa did not want to pull away. She had never wanted anything more than she wanted Harrison to kiss her in that moment. When his lips finally met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a promise more than a demand. Louisa felt like something inside her that had been frozen for years was finally thawing, warming in the heat of Harrison's affection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Harrison rested his forehead against hers. "I have wanted to do that since the first day I saw you sitting outside the mercantile with that law book," he admitted. Louisa laughed softly. "I had no idea. You seemed so calm and collected." "I am good at hiding my feelings when I need to, but with you, Louisa, I do not want to hide anything. I want to be completely honest about what I feel." They stayed up late that night, talking and stealing kisses by the firelight. It felt like the beginning of something momentous, something that would change both their lives forever. And as Louisa finally drifted off to sleep in her bedroll, she felt happier than she had in years. They arrived back at Louisa's ranch in the early afternoon of the following day. Robert had kept everything in perfect order, and the cattle looked content grazing near the creek. "How did it go?" Robert asked as they dismounted. "Better than we could have hoped," Harrison told him. "Thank you for taking care of things here." After Robert left, Harrison helped Louisa unpack and settle back in. Before he left for his own ranch, he pulled her into a long, lingering kiss that left her breathless. "I will come by tomorrow," he promised. "We need to decide on our next steps for dealing with Denton." "Tomorrow," Louisa agreed, not wanting to let him go but knowing they both had responsibilities. That night, Louisa sat at her table and carefully reviewed all the notes she had taken in Phoenix. The evidence was damning. Denton had clearly and deliberately used false survey information to defraud her father. But having evidence and getting a judge to act on it were two different things. She spent the next several days researching legal precedents and drafting a formal complaint. Harrison came by every day, sometimes to help with her legal work, sometimes just to spend time with her. Their relationship was deepening with each passing day, evolving from attraction into something that felt solid and real. One evening about a week after their return from Phoenix, Harrison showed up with a bouquet of wildflowers he had picked on his way over. Louisa felt her heart melt at the simple, thoughtful gesture. "They are beautiful," she said, finding a jar to put them in. "Thank you." "Not as beautiful as you," Harrison said, pulling her into his arms. "I have been thinking, Louisa. Once this situation with Denton is resolved, I would like to officially court you. With your permission, I would like to speak to your pastor. Let the town know my intentions are honorable." "I would like that," Louisa said, reaching up to touch his face. "Though I think most of the town has already figured out that something is happening between us. Martha Henderson gave me a very knowing look when I was in the mercantile yesterday." Harrison laughed. "Martha does not miss much. But I want to do this right. You deserve to be courted properly, not rushed into anything." "I appreciate that," Louisa said. "Though I have to admit, I do not feel like I am being rushed. Everything with you feels natural, like it was meant to be." "I feel the same way." Harrison kissed her forehead, then her cheek, then finally her lips. Each kiss was tender and reverent, and Louisa felt cherished in a way she never had before. 2 weeks later, Louisa received a notice that the circuit judge would be arriving in Apache Junction in 3 days. It was the moment she had been preparing for, the opportunity to present her case. But as the date approached, her anxiety grew. "What if the judge does not take me seriously?" she asked Harrison one evening. They were sitting on her porch, watching the sun set over the mountains. "What if Denton has already gotten to him?" "Then we will find another way," Harrison said calmly. "But I do not think that will happen. The evidence you have is too strong. Any honest judge will see that Denton committed fraud." "The key word being honest," Louisa said. "Not all judges are." "True. But we have to have faith in the system, or what is the point of fighting?" The day the judge arrived, Louisa dressed in her best dress, the one Martha had given her fabric for. She had stayed up late several nights in a row sewing it, and the result was a simple but elegant navy blue dress that fit her perfectly. Harrison had offered to go with her to the courthouse, but Louisa insisted on doing this part alone. "This is my fight," she told him. "I need to face Denton myself." "I understand," Harrison said, "but I will be right outside if you need me." The courthouse was the largest building in Apache Junction, a two-story structure that also served as the town hall. Louisa climbed the steps with her leather folder of documents clutched tightly in her hands, her heart pounding. Inside, she found the circuit judge, a stern-looking man in his 60s named Judge William Parker, sitting behind a large oak desk. Marcus Denton was already there, looking smug and confident in an expensive suit. He was a man in his early 50s, with graying hair and cold eyes that reminded Louisa of a snake. "Miss Camden," Judge Parker said, gesturing to a chair, "I received your petition. This is a serious accusation you are making against Mr. Denton." "I am aware of that, Your Honor," Louisa said, forcing herself to speak clearly and confidently. "But I have evidence to support my claims." "Evidence?" Denton said with a dismissive laugh. "Your Honor, this is a waste of the court's time. Miss Camden is a grieving daughter who cannot accept that her father made some poor business decisions. There was no fraud involved in our transactions." "Then you would not mind if I present the evidence I gathered from the Territorial Land Office in Phoenix," Louisa said coolly, meeting Denton's eyes without flinching. For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Denton's face. "What evidence?" Louisa opened her folder and began laying out the documents and her carefully written notes. "The original survey maps from the Territorial Land Office show that the property lines and water rights described in your contracts do not match the official records. Furthermore, I found a notation showing that you requested an amendment to the survey, but that amendment was denied by the territorial surveyor. Yet you proceeded to create contracts based on that denied amendment, effectively using false information to defraud my father." Judge Parker leaned forward, his expression growing more serious. "Is this true, Mr. Denton?" Well, there may have been some confusion about the survey," Denton stammered, his confidence evaporating. "But it was an honest mistake, not fraud." "An honest mistake that coincidentally benefited you to the tune of several hundred acres of land and water rights," Louisa said, her voice sharp. "And I suppose it was also an honest mistake when you used similar tactics with the Thompson family and tried to use them with Henry Walsh." "You cannot prove that," Denton said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, I can. I spoke to Henry Walsh last week, and he is prepared to testify about the contracts you presented to him, which contained many of the same fraudulent provisions. He recognized what you were doing and refused to sign, which is why he still has his ranch." Judge Parker was now studying the documents Louisa had laid out with great interest. He asked her several detailed questions about the survey maps and the land office records, and Louisa answered each one with confidence, drawing on the knowledge she had worked so hard to acquire. After nearly an hour of questioning, Judge Parker sat back in his chair and fixed Denton with a stern look. "Mr. Denton, based on the evidence Miss Camden has presented, I am inclined to agree with her assessment. These contracts appear to have been based on fraudulent survey information. Do you have any evidence to refute her claims?" Denton's face had gone red with anger and embarrassment. "Your Honor, this is outrageous. You are going to take the word of an uneducated woman over mine." "I am going to take the word of official Territorial Land Office records and survey maps," Judge Parker said coldly. "Miss Camden has done her homework, Mr. Denton, which is more than I can say for you. I am ruling in favor of Miss Camden. The contracts between you and her late father are hereby declared null and void due to fraud. All property and water rights that were transferred under those contracts are to be returned to Miss Camden immediately. Louisa felt like she could not breathe. She had won. After months of study and struggle, she had actually won. But Judge Parker was not finished. Furthermore, I am ordering a full investigation into your business practices, Mr. Denton. If it is found that you have defrauded other ranchers in this territory using similar methods, you will face criminal charges. You are dismissed. Denton stood, his face twisted with rage. As he passed Louisa on his way out, he leaned in close and hissed, "This is not over, you stupid girl. I will destroy you for this." "I do not think you will," Louisa said quietly, "because if you try, I will fight you again, and now I know I can win." Denton stormed out, and Louisa was left alone with Judge Parker. The judge smiled at her, the first warm expression she had seen from him. "Miss Camden, that was one of the most impressive presentations I have seen in my years on the bench. You taught yourself law from a single book." "Yes, Your Honor. A book you loaned me, actually." Judge Parker's eyebrows rose. "That old property law text, I had forgotten I left that behind." "Well, it seems you put it to excellent use. Have you considered pursuing law as a profession? Women cannot practice law in Arizona territory, Your Honor." "Not yet," the judge said thoughtfully. "But that may change in time. You certainly have the aptitude for it. In the meantime, if you ever need legal advice or assistance, please do not hesitate to contact me. What you did here today took courage and intelligence, and I admire that." "Thank you, Your Honor," Louisa said, her voice thick with emotion. "That means more than you know." She left the courthouse in a daze, her mind still trying to process what had just happened. Harrison was waiting outside, and the moment he saw her face, he knew. "You won," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I won," Louisa confirmed. And then she was laughing and crying at the same time, all the tension and fear of the past months releasing in a flood of emotion. Harrison held her until she calmed down, then kissed her right there on the courthouse steps in full view of anyone who cared to look. "I am so proud of you," he said. "You fought for what was right and you won. No one will cheat you again, Louisa. You made sure of that." The news of Louisa's victory spread through Apache Junction like wildfire. Some people were supportive, congratulating her on her courage. Others were scandalized that a woman had dared to challenge a prominent businessman in court. But Louisa found that she did not care what the gossips thought. She had her family's land back, and she had proven to herself and everyone else that she was nobody's victim. Over the next several weeks, the process of transferring the property back to Louisa's name was completed. Denton, facing a territorial investigation into his business practices, quietly left Apache Junction and was not seen again. Rumor had it he had moved to California, where hopefully his reputation had preceded him. With her land restored, Louisa threw herself into rebuilding her ranch. Harrison helped her, bringing over some of his cattle to supplement her herd, and helping to repair fences and buildings that had fallen into disrepair. His presence at her ranch became so regular that people began referring to them as a couple, and neither of them made any effort to correct that assumption. One evening in late October, as they sat on Louisa's porch watching another spectacular sunset, Harrison took her hand. "Louisa, I know I said I wanted to court you properly, and I feel like we have done that. We have been spending time together for almost 4 months now, and every day I become more certain that you are the woman I want to spend my life with." Louisa's heart began to race. "Harrison." "Let me finish," he said gently. "I know you are an independent woman. You have proven you can run a ranch, fight legal battles, and take care of yourself. You do not need a man to complete you or rescue you. But I hope you want a partner, someone to share your life with, someone to build a future alongside. Because I want that, Louisa. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep next to you every night. I want to build our ranches into something bigger and better than either of us could do alone. I want to have children with you and raise them to be as strong and brave as their mother. Louisa Camden, will you marry me? Tears streamed down Louisa's face, but she was smiling. Yes, she said. Yes, Harrison, I will marry you. I love you. I think I have loved you since that first day when you rode with me back to my ranch and offered to help me fight Denton. Harrison pulled a small box from his pocket and opened it to reveal a simple gold band with a small diamond. It is not much, he said, but I wanted to give you something beautiful. It is perfect, Louisa said as he slipped it onto her finger. You are perfect. They were married 6 weeks later in a small ceremony at the church in Apache Junction. Martha Henderson cried happy tears, and Judge Parker, who happened to be passing through town again, attended and congratulated them both. Robert and the rest of Harrison's ranch hands came, along with a handful of townspeople who had supported Louisa throughout her ordeal. Louisa wore a new dress that Martha had helped her sew, a beautiful cream-colored creation with delicate lace trim. Harrison wore his best suit, and when he saw Louisa walking down the aisle toward him, his eyes filled with emotion. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the pastor asked them to exchange vows, Harrison spoke first. Louisa, I vow to be your partner in all things, to support your dreams and ambitions, to treat you as an equal, and to love you with all my heart for the rest of my days. Louisa's voice was steady despite her tears. Harrison, I vow to share my life with you completely, to trust you with my heart and my future, to be your companion and your friend, and to love you without reservation for as long as we both shall live. When they kissed, sealing their marriage, Louisa felt like her heart might burst from happiness. She had never imagined during those dark months after her father's death that she would find this kind of joy. But here she was, married to a man who respected her strength and loved her for exactly who she was. They combined their 2 ranches, creating a larger operation that they ran together as equal partners. Louisa continued to study law in her spare time, and she became known throughout the territory as someone who could help people understand contracts and legal documents. More than once, she helped other ranchers avoid being cheated by unscrupulous land speculators. In the spring of 1884, Louisa discovered she was pregnant. She was nervous about becoming a mother, but Harrison was overjoyed. Our child will be lucky to have you as a mother, he told her. You will teach them to be strong and fair and never to back down from a fight. Their son was born in December of 1884, a healthy baby boy with his father's blue-gray eyes and his mother's dark hair. They named him Thomas, after Louisa's father. Harrison was a devoted father from the start, staying up with Louisa during the long nights when the baby fussed, and sharing equally in the work of caring for their son. 2 years later, they had a daughter, a spirited little girl they named Grace, after Harrison's mother. And 2 years after that, another son arrived, whom they named William after Judge Parker, who had become a good friend to them both. As the years passed, the ranch prospered. Louisa and Harrison worked side by side, raising their children to understand the value of hard work, honesty, and standing up for what was right. They taught Thomas, Grace, and William to ride almost as soon as they could walk, and all 3 children grew up comfortable with ranch life. Louisa never stopped studying law. Her collection of legal books grew, and she continued to help people in the community navigate legal issues. There was talk that the territory might eventually allow women to practice law officially, and Louisa held on to the hope that someday she might see that dream realized. But more than any professional achievement, Louisa treasured her family. Every evening, when they all sat down to dinner together, she looked around the table at her husband and children and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. She had started with nothing but a borrowed law book and a stubborn refusal to accept defeat. Now she had everything that mattered. Harrison often told the story of how they met, of the determined young woman he had seen reading a law book outside the mercantile, and how he had known from that first moment that she was someone special. "She taught herself law from one borrowed book," he would say, his voice full of pride. "And I told her that no one would cheat her again. I'm happy to say I kept that promise." And Louisa, sitting beside him, would take his hand and smile, remembering the journey they had taken together. It had not been easy. There had been struggles and setbacks, moments of doubt and fear. But through it all, they had faced everything together. Two people who had found each other at exactly the right moment and built a life that exceeded both their dreams. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Harrison surprised Louisa with a gift. It was a beautiful leather-bound book with her name embossed on the cover in gold letters. Inside, the pages were blank. "What is this for?" Louisa asked, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift. "I thought you could write down your knowledge," Harrison said. "All the things you have learned about law and contracts over the years. Maybe someday it will help other women who find themselves in situations like you did. You could call it a practical guide to protecting yourself under the law." Louisa's eyes filled with tears. "That is a wonderful idea. Thank you, Harrison." She did eventually write that book, filling the pages with clear explanations of property law, contract law, and the rights of women under territorial law. She made copies by hand and distributed them to women in Apache Junction and the surrounding area. More than one woman came to thank her, saying that her guide had helped them avoid being cheated or had given them the knowledge to stand up for themselves. The years passed, and their children grew up. Thomas took over much of the day-to-day operation of the ranch, showing a natural talent for managing cattle and land. Grace became a teacher, opening a small school in Apache Junction where she taught children to read, write, and think critically. William, the youngest, followed in his mother's footsteps and went to study law in California, one of the first territories to allow women in his graduating class. A sign that times were indeed changing. Through it all, Louisa and Harrison remained devoted to each other. Their love, which had started with an offer of help and a shared determination to fight injustice, had deepened into something unshakable. They were partners in every sense of the word, sharing the joys and burdens of life equally. On warm summer evenings, they would still sit on their porch, now expanded and improved but still offering the same spectacular view of the Superstition Mountains, and watch the sunset together. Harrison would take Louisa's hand, weathered now from years of hard work, and she would lean against his shoulder, comfortable and content. "You ever regret it?" Harrison asked one evening. "All the struggles, all the battles you had to fight?" Louisa thought about it for a moment, then shook her head. "No, those struggles made me who I am. They brought me to you. If I could go back and change things, make it easier, I would not. Because every challenge I faced was a lesson, and every lesson brought me closer to the life I have now." "I feel the same way," Harrison said. "Everything in my past, even the painful parts, led me here. To you, to our children, to this life we built together." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange, pink, and purple. In the distance, they could hear their grandchildren playing, Thomas's children who came to visit regularly and brought life and laughter to the ranch. "We did good, didn't we?" Louisa said softly. "We built something worth having." "We did better than good," Harrison replied. "We built something that will last long after we are gone. Our children, our grandchildren, they will carry on what we started. And maybe because of what you did, because you stood up and fought back, other women will find it a little easier to do the same." "I hope so," Louisa said. "I hope that someday a woman will not need to teach herself law from a borrowed book to be heard. I hope the law will protect everyone equally, regardless of their gender or their station in life." "That is a good dream," Harrison said, "and if anyone can help make it come true, it is you." Louisa smiled and squeezed his hand. They had both come so far from where they started. Harrison, the cowboy from Texas running from his past, and Louisa, the young woman determined to save her father's ranch, had found each other and built a future neither had dared to imagine. As stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Louisa thought about the borrowed law book that had started it all, long since returned to Judge Parker but forever etched in her memory. That book had been her weapon, her shield, and ultimately her liberation. It had taught her that knowledge was power, that the law could be used to protect as well as to harm, and that a determined person, regardless of gender, could fight back against injustice and win. But more than any of that, it had led her to Harrison, the cowboy who had seen her studying that book and recognized a kindred spirit. The man who had told her that no one would cheat her again and had stood by that promise through everything that followed. The partner who had loved her not despite her strength but because of it. They had built a good life together, filled with love, children, hard work, and quiet evenings watching the sun set over the Superstition Mountains. It was more than either of them had hoped for, and exactly what both of them needed. As they finally stood to go inside, Harrison pulled Louisa into his arms one more time. "I love you," he said simply. "I have loved you from the beginning, and I will love you until my last breath." "And I love you," Louisa replied, her voice full of emotion. "Thank you for finding me, for believing in me, for being exactly the partner I needed." They walked into their home together, hand in hand, ready to face whatever came next as they always had since that day in Apache Junction when their paths first crossed. United in love, equal in partnership, and forever grateful for the journey that had brought them together. The borrowed law book had taught Louisa how to fight for justice. Harrison had taught her that she did not have to fight alone. Together, they had created a legacy of strength, love, and determination that would endure for generations to come. And that, Louisa reflected as she climbed into bed beside her husband, was the happiest ending she could have ever imagined.